October 25th, 1938. A sleek Douglas DC-2, known as the Kyeema, lifted off from Adelaide, bound for Melbourne. On board were 18 souls, businessmen, a member of parliament, and a young air hostess on duty. Just 20 minutes from landing safely at their destination, it vanished into the fog and never came out. At exactly 1:45 p.m, radio operator Bill Lauder-Cridge heard something that would haunt him forever. Then a thunderous crash echoed through the hills of Mount Dandenong. Locals rushed to the scene, only to find wreckage engulfed in flames, twisted metal scattered through the trees, and no survivors. What happened in those final moments above the fog-covered mountains? How did an experienced crew with perfect weather behind them fly 20 miles past their airport and straight into a mountain? Was it pilot error, a failed system, or something no one saw coming? The Kyeema disaster didn't just claim 18 lives. It exposed a terrifying truth about aviation in the 1930s Australia and changed flying forever. To understand this tragedy, we need to go back, not just to the day of the crash, but to the machine at the center of it all, the Douglas DC-2. It represented the absolute cutting edge of aviation technology. In the early 1930s, aviation was changing fast. The world was moving away from wooden aircraft, which were seen as unsafe and outdated. Airlines wanted something stronger, faster, and more reliable. That's when the Douglas Aircraft Company stepped in. The Douglas DC-2 was one of the first all-metal airliners of its kind. It had a sleek, modern look, a streamlined fuselage, a strong tapered wing, retractable landing gear, and two powerful Wright radial engines that each produced 710 horsepower. These engines turned variable pitch propellers, allowing better performance in different flight conditions. Inside, the DC-2 had a narrow but comfortable cabin designed to carry 14 passengers, a respectable number for the time. It had a maximum cruising speed of around 190 miles per hour, a range of more than 1,000 miles, and it could fly at altitudes up to 20,000 feet. This was cutting-edge technology in the mid-1930s. The aircraft involved in the crash was a DC-2 named Kyeema, with the registration VHUYC. It was operated by Australian National Airways, the country's most prominent airline at the time. Kyeema had already completed many successful flights across Australia. It was well maintained, considered airworthy, and flown by experienced crew. But it wasn't just the plane that played a role in the disaster. It was the mountain. Mount Dandenong, known by its traditional Aboriginal name, Korhan Warrabul, rises from the forested hills just 45 kilometres east of Melbourne. At 633 metres, or over 2,000 feet high, it's part of the Dandenong Ranges, a rugged extension of the Great Dividing Range. Often wrapped in fog and cloud, the mountain can become invisible to the naked eye, especially from the air. Tuesday morning, October 25th, 1938, Adelaide's Parafield Airport. Kyeema prepared for its return flight from Adelaide to Melbourne. The aircraft had completed the first leg of the journey without issue. Captain Webb completed his pre-flight inspection. First Officer Steen checked the weather reports. Hostess Elva Jones welcomed the 14 passengers aboard. At precisely 11:22 a.m, the Douglas DC-2 lifted off from Parafield Airport. Its engines roared as it climbed steadily into the skies over South Australia. Among the 14 passengers on board was federal parliamentarian Charles Hawker, along with business travellers, a hostess named Elva Jones, and cadet pilot Philip Pring. The first part of the flight was smooth. Weather conditions over most of the route were fair, and the crew maintained visual contact with the ground while cruising at an altitude of 11,000 feet. The flight to Melbourne should take just 2 hours and 23 minutes. Landing time, 1:45 p.m. The mathematics were simple. At their current speed, they would reach Daylesford at 1:25 p.m. From there, just 20 more minutes to Essendon Airport. What nobody knew was that 350 miles away, weather was building over Melbourne. A thick layer of cloud had settled over the region. Visibility dropped sharply. The cloud cover stretched from 1,500 feet all the way down to 400 feet. A dense wall of grey that made it nearly impossible to see any landmarks below. For pilots of that era, without modern GPS or radar, visual navigation was essential. Without it, every decision became a guessing game. At around 1:32 p.m, cadet pilot Philip Pring radioed Essendon Airport, reporting that the Kyeema was passing Daylesford at 7,000 feet. But there was a fatal mistake. The crew hadn't reached Daylesford at all. Through a break in the clouds, they had mistakenly identified the town of Sunbury as Daylesford, placing themselves nearly 30 kilometres behind their actual position. That single misjudgment set off a tragic chain of events. Believing they were still west of the airport, the crew began descending, expecting to break through the cloud and see Essendon Airfield below. But they had already overshot it. At 1:45 p.m, the exact moment they were scheduled to land, the Kyeema, still hidden in dense fog, slammed into the western slope of Mount Dandenong. Locals clearing underbrush nearby heard the roar of engines growing louder, followed by a metallic screech. Then a thunderous explosion. Flames shot up through the trees and thick smoke poured into the sky. The wreckage was torn apart. There were no survivors. The exact final seconds before the crash are still debated. The Kyeema was descending through thick cloud, unaware that it had already passed Essendon Airport. Ahead of them, hidden by fog, was the western slope of Mount Dandenong. Some believe the pilots may have caught a glimpse of the mountain at the last moment. There are reports suggesting that, in those final seconds, they tried to turn the aircraft away. But that decision may have made things worse. Instead of passing between two peaks, the new flight path sent the plane straight into one. Inside the cockpit, the crew was likely unsure of their position. Radio transcripts reveal that the Kyeema had asked for a radio bearing from Essendon, a way to confirm their exact location. Essendon's controller responded and instructed them to leave their transmitter on so the bearing could be calculated. The Kyeema acknowledged, then fell silent. Moments later, the mountain was no longer ahead. It was underneath. At 1:45 p.m, the same time the aircraft was scheduled to land, a thunderous explosion echoed through the hills. The Douglas DC-2 disintegrated on impact. The fuselage was torn open. The wings were ripped away by trees. Flames engulfed what remained. Locals Bob Logan and Tom Murphy were clearing brush nearby when they heard the engines, the sudden screeching of metal, and then the blast. They ran toward the smoke. What they found was horrifying. Burning wreckage scattered across the slope with no chance of rescue. The heat was so intense, they couldn't even approach the bodies. News of the crash spread quickly. In an era when aviation was still earning the public's trust, this was a national shock. A modern aircraft, an experienced crew, and not a single survivor. Among the 18 people lost was Charles Hawker, a respected member of Parliament. The loss wasn't just tragic, it was deeply symbolic. It forced the public, the press, and the government to ask the same painful question. How could this have happened? Australia was in shock. The crash of the Kyeema wasn't just an aviation disaster, it was a national crisis. And in a time when public trust in air travel was still fragile, the demand for answers was immediate and overwhelming. 3 days after the crash, on October 30th, 1938, a royal commission was formally launched by the Australian federal government. It would become one of the most significant investigations in the history of the country's civil aviation. Chaired by Colonel Thomas Murdoch, DSO, the inquiry brought together military officials, aviation experts, and public servants. It wasn't just about what happened, it was about why it happened and how to ensure it never happened again. The evidence was damning. Investigators confirmed that the Kyeema had overshot Essendon Airport and flown blind into Mount Dandenong, all because the flight crew had been unable to accurately determine their position in the cloud-covered skies. But the real shock came when they uncovered systemic failures behind the scenes. At the time, no national system existed for tracking flights in real time. There were no flight checking officers monitoring aircraft en route, no safeguards to confirm positions, and no radio navigation aids to help crews find their way through poor visibility. The Commission recommended sweeping changes, starting with the introduction of trained flight checking officers who would monitor aircraft, provide weather updates, and advise on alternate landing options. But perhaps the most important reform was the urgent rollout of a 33 MHz radio range system, a revolutionary network that would allow pilots to pinpoint their position with radio signals rather than guesswork. Yet behind the technical recommendations, the inquiry exposed political friction and cost-cutting that had delayed life-saving technology. One man, Major Melville Langslow, was singled out, a powerful figure in both the Civil Aviation Board and the RAF Air Board. Langslow had allegedly resisted funding safety trials, including early versions of navigation beacons that might have prevented the Kyeema disaster. His actions drew sharp criticism, and the consequences didn't end there. When Langslow was later promoted to Secretary of the Department of Air, he reportedly went out of his way to punish those who had challenged him, including RAF officer Eric Harrison, who had served on the Kyeema investigation team. The inquiry had done more than uncover a tragedy. It had exposed deep conflict within Australia's aviation leadership and forced a long overdue reckoning with safety, technology, and political accountability. And from the ashes of the Kyeema disaster, a new era was born. The old Civil Aviation Board was scrapped, and a dedicated Department of Civil Aviation was created, marking the true beginning of modern air traffic control in Australia. The wreckage of the Kyeema may have been cleared long ago, but its story still echoes through Australia's skies. It was a tragedy that exposed the flaws of an evolving industry, a disaster that demanded change and delivered it at a heavy cost. What do you think about the decisions that were made before this flight? Could the disaster have been prevented? And how far have we really come since then? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.